The day began like any other in the small frontier town. The sun crawling lazily over the red cliffs and spilling golden light across the wooden cabins and dusty streets. But beneath the quiet there was an unease that no one admitted. For today was not a day of celebration as the town elders pretended. It was a day of conquest disguised as a wedding, a day when power sought to humiliate pride, and the victim was a young Apache girl whose name most townsfolk never cared to know, a virgin they had dragged from her people and dressed in stiff, white cloth that did not belong to her world, binding her hair with ribbons instead of feathers, and leading her through the street as if she were some prize they had won in battle. The townsfolk gathered, men with cigars dangling from their lips, women whispering behind gloved hands, children tugging at their mothers' skirts to get a better look at the strange bride. And when she passed, they smirked, for in their eyes, she was not a person, but a symbol, the proof that settlers ruled now, that the Apache had been broken. Yet her eyes told a different story, though few dared to meet them. Dark, steady, burning with a silent fire, not of tears, for she had sworn she would not cry, but of a strength that could not be dressed in white nor silenced by ceremony. The wealthy rancher who was to marry her stood stiffly at the church doors, a man chosen by his family more for his land than his heart, his jaw set as if he were preparing for battle rather than union, for though he agreed to the marriage, he did so with the weight of shame pressing against him. Ashamed not because of her, but because of the way the town had twisted the sacred into spectacle. The preacher's voice rang hollow as he recited vows that were not hers, words heavy with the language of a god who was not her own. And when he told her to speak, she said nothing, her silence louder than any promise, her lips pressed tight, her gaze cutting through the crowd like a knife. The people laughed nervously, some nudging each other, whispering that perhaps she did not understand, but in truth she understood perfectly. This was not a marriage. It was a theft, an attempt to erase her, to break her spirit before all eyes. And she would give them no such satisfaction. When the preacher at last declared them man and wife, the crowd erupted in mock applause, a cheer that sounded more like jeering, and some of the young men tossed their hats in the air as though mocking the traditions of her people, mocking her womanhood, mocking the very life being stripped from her. She walked beside the rancher as they left the church, her steps steady despite the weight of humiliation pressing against her chest, her hands clenched in the folds of the borrowed dress, her heart pounding not with defeat, but with a dangerous kind of patience. For though the town believed they had won, though they believed she was now theirs to tame, to mold, to use as a symbol of Apache submission, she carried within her something none of them could see. A thread, fragile but unbroken, stretching from her heart to the hills beyond, to the warriors who had raised her, to the ancestors who whispered through blood and memory that no chain, no dress, no forced vow could ever strip her of who she was. The rancher's family hosted a gathering after the ceremony, filling their house with the smell of roasted meat and the clatter of glasses, the women gossiping about her size, her silence, her strange beauty, while the men laughed too loudly, their pride swelling at the sight of her sitting stiffly at the table, an ornament to their triumph. Yet even there, in the heart of her captivity, her eyes roamed the horizon through the window, watching the fading sun as if it carried a promise, her silence gnawing at the edges of the settlers' confidence. For though they told themselves they had broken her, none could shake the unease that her stillness was not surrender but defiance, waiting for its moment. That night, as the town slept drunken on their victory, the girl sat alone by the window of the rancher's home, the white dress now wrinkled and stained with dust, her hands clasped tightly around the small piece of leather hidden in her sleeve, a token from her tribe, a silent signal, a promise that she was not forgotten. She pressed it to her lips, and for the first time since the morning, she allowed a single tear to fall, not for her shame, but for the message she had sent through the hidden paths, for the riders she knew would see it, for the dawn that would. not bring silence, but thunder. The town believed they had forced her into marriage, but in truth, they had forced themselves into a reckoning, for they had mocked not just a girl, but a people. And though the night was quiet, the hills beyond stirred with the faint echo of hooves that would soon grow louder, carrying with them the answer to her silence. The night after the forced wedding weighed heavy on the little frontier town, silence wrapping itself around the wooden cabins like a shroud, broken only by the distant howl of coyotes and the creak of doors in the desert wind. But inside the rancher's house, where the Apache girl had been placed as a bride, silence held a different meaning. For it was not submission, it was strategy, and every breath she drew was measured, every glance she cast toward the dark horizon calculated, her body still, her spirit burning, and her mind turning like a wheel none of the settlers could see. They believed her broken. They believed the forced union had stripped her of will, but in truth she was sharper than ever, waiting for the moment when darkness could hide her hand, when whispers could travel further than screams. And as the household fell into drunken slumber with the rancher's kin snoring in nearby rooms and the town at rest from its day of mockery, she moved. Hidden beneath the stiff folds of her white dress, still stained with dust from the church steps, she carried a strip of leather, carved and painted with symbols only her people could read, and on it she had marked her truth. Not words of surrender, but a cry for blood, a signal of humiliation endured, and a call for vengeance. She waited until the oil lamp in the hall sputtered and died, until even the guards outside had grown lazy, their boots scraping the dirt as they leaned, half asleep, against the fence, and then she slipped from her chair by the window and moved like a shadow. Her bare feet knew the wooden boards better than her captors ever could, avoiding the creaks, avoiding the cracks, until she reached the back door, where the desert air swept in cool and sharp. Beyond the fences lay a world the townsfolk thought was theirs now, but she knew better. The land still remembered her people, still carried the whispers of warriors who had once ruled these plains, and it would carry her message. She bent low, crouched against the shadows, and pulled from beneath her sleeve the leather strip, then cut her palm with the edge of a broken nail until blood welled, dark and red, and smeared it across the carving, sealing her signal in the oldest ink of all. Then she buried it beneath a stone at the edge of the fence, a place where the runners of her tribe knew to look, a place used for generations to pass word unseen. And as she pressed her hand to the earth, she whispered, not to God, not to the town, but to the night itself, that her people would hear, that they would come, that she was not alone. Behind her, the rancher stirred in his room, restless in sleep, his conscience gnawed by what had been done, yet too bound by duty to rise, too afraid to face her eyes. But she heard him and knew his conflict, and it only hardened her resolve, for she would not wait on the pity of a man, she would wait for the fury of her kin. When she slipped back inside, wiping her bloodied hand against the inside of her dress, no one stirred, no one saw, and to any who glanced upon her she appeared. The same, silent, motionless, defeated. But beyond the horizon, across the mesas and canyons, her message had already begun to move. There were men among her tribe, scouts with eyes like hawks, who even in the dead of night crept near the settlement to watch, to listen. And when they saw the stone newly disturbed, when they uncovered the leather marked with her blood, they did not weep. They did not hesitate. They mounted their horses and carried it through the dark, racing across the land like lightning. And one by one the fires in distant camps were lit, the war drums whispering at first, then rising. Back in the town, no one knew. The gamblers at the saloon still laughed over their cards. The sheriff slept heavy with his rifle by the bed. The women dreamt smug dreams of victory. But the desert was already awake, already stirring, and the silence of the bride was no longer silence at all. It was a war cry buried beneath the earth, waiting to bloom at dawn. By the time the stars wheeled westward and the first pale line of light touched the cliffs, the message had traveled farther than any horse the settlers owned, and 200 warriors were already tightening their saddles, their faces painted. In the colors of vengeance, their arrows tipped, their chants rising like a storm from the earth itself. And in the little house by the edge of the town, the girl sat once more by the window, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her eyes on the horizon, her silence unbroken. But in the steady rise and fall of her chest was the certainty that her people had heard her call, and that the town which thought itself safe was already standing on the edge of ruin. Far away from the sleeping frontier town, where laughter still echoed faintly in the saloon and the rancher's household rested under the false belief that the marriage had secured their victory, the Apache lands were stirring for the message. Sent in silence had already reached its destination, carried on the swift hooves of scouts and sealed in the sacred blood of their stolen daughter, and when the warriors uncovered the leather strip marked with her hand, they did not pause to question, for they knew the weight of such a signal. It was not a plea, it was a command. It was the voice of their honor crying from captivity, and to ignore it would be to spit on the graves of their ancestors. The camps lit with sudden fire, not of celebration but of gathering, drums beaten softly at first so the rhythm would crawl under the skin of every sleeper until they rose one by one, faces painted in the dark, eyes glowing with purpose. The chiefs spoke in low, urgent tones, reminding their men that this was not just about a girl, not just about a forced marriage, but about every insult, every theft, every drop of blood spilled on stolen land. And with each word, the men straightened, their chests expanding, their hands tightening on the hilts of their knives and the shafts of their spears. Horses were pulled from their tethers, restless and snorting, their hooves striking sparks as though they too sensed the storm building, and across the ridges, small fires burned like stars fallen to earth, signaling from camp to camp that the time had come. The young warriors, eager with fury, painted their faces in stripes of red and black, the colors of vengeance and war, while the elders moved among them, touching foreheads, whispering blessings, binding the generations together in one cause. The night sky itself seemed to bend under the weight of their chants, deep and rolling, echoing against the canyon walls, until even the coyotes fell silent. Scouts returned breathless with news of the town. How the settlers slept unaware, how the guards at the fences leaned half-drunk against posts, how the new bride sat like a shadow in the rancher's window, her silence more terrible than screams. And at this, the warriors' fury grew into something unstoppable, not wild chaos, but sharpened purpose. For if their daughter could endure mockery and silence, they could answer it with thunder. The chiefs raised their hands, and the chanting grew louder, filling the canyons, rolling like distant thunder that promised rain, and then with a signal, they mounted, one after another, until 200 strong sat on restless horses, the ground trembling beneath their weight. The storm was not of clouds, but of men, of hooves and hearts, of arrows tipped and ready, and as they began to move, the land itself seemed to breathe with them, the desert winds carrying their scent, the mesas echoing their rhythm. Through the night they rode, their silhouettes black against the starlit horizon, dust rising in ghostly trails behind them, their pace relentless, for every heartbeat carried them closer to the town that had mocked their blood. They moved like a tide, unstoppable, ancient, the very earth lending them strength, and though no settler yet stirred in their beds, though the sheriff still dreamed heavy and the gamblers still snored with cards in their hands, the fate of the town had already shifted, for a storm once set in motion cannot be undone. And as the first faint whisper of dawn brushed the horizon, painting the cliffs in pale silver, the warriors tightened their ranks, the chiefs raising their weapons to the light, their chants now silent, their breath one with their horses, waiting for the moment when the sun would break, when day would reveal them in full, and the town would wake not to peace, but to reckoning, not to laughter, but to the sight of 200 warriors rising from the earth like a storm made flesh, summoned by the silent message of a girl they thought broken, but who had in truth unleashed the fury of a nation. Dawn crept slowly over the desert, the pale light spilling across the jagged cliffs and the endless plains, painting the land in fragile gold. But for the little frontier town asleep at its heart, that sunrise would not bring peace. It would bring reckoning, for while the townsfolk snored heavy from their night of mockery and drink, while the sheriff stirred in his bed unaware, and while the rancher's household dozed uneasily with the new bride sitting silent in her chair, the earth itself was trembling with the approach of 200 Apache warriors, their hooves pounding in rhythm like drums of judgment, their ranks black against the paling horizon, their breath steaming in the cool air as if the land itself exhaled fury. The girl, still cloaked in the stiff white dress forced upon her, had not moved from her place by the window. Her face was calm, but her eyes fixed sharply on that horizon, as though she had been waiting for this moment since the first insult had been cast. And when the faint echo of hooves reached her ears, she did not flinch. She did not cry. She simply rose, her back straight, her hands unclenching at last, and the faintest curve of defiance flickered across her lips. The first settlers to rise that morning did so groggily, an old man carrying a bucket to the well, a boy chasing a stray dog. But their movements froze when the sound grew louder, deeper, like thunder rolling closer. And then they saw it. A dark line stretching across the desert floor, moving as one, the earth beneath it quaking. And as the line grew clearer, they saw the truth. Warriors painted in red and black, their weapons glinting in the dawn, their horses charging steady, and at their center, tall and unbroken, their stolen daughter riding with her head high, no longer a bride in captivity, but a symbol of defiance leading her people home. Panic spread through the town like fire on dry grass. Doors banged open, women screamed, men stumbled into the street half-dressed, shouting for rifles, for the sheriff, for God himself. But it was too late. The storm was upon them. The sheriff, pulling on his boots, tried to rally men to the barricades, but even he faltered when he saw their number, when he realized this was no small raiding party but an army, and behind him, townsfolk whispered prayers that turned to curses, blaming the rancher, blaming the marriage, blaming anyone but themselves, yet all knew in their hearts that this reckoning was earned. The warriors thundered closer, dust billowing like smoke, and then they halted at the edge of the town, 200 strong, silent now, the kind of silence that bends the spine, that speaks louder than any yell, and in that silence the girl dismounted, her white dress torn and dirt-stained, but her presence fierce, and she walked forward until she stood between the two worlds, the settlers who thought they had won, and the warriors who refused to bow. For a heartbeat, time froze. The settlers clutching rifles, the warriors gripping spears, the rancher himself pushing through the crowd, his face pale, caught between shame and something unspoken. And then the girl raised her hand, not trembling, not begging but commanding, her voice ringing out clear as the dawn. She was no bride, she was no trophy. She was the blood of her people, and she would not kneel. The warriors roared then, a sound like mountains splitting, and the settlers staggered back, their rifles shaking, their pride collapsing under the weight of that fury. And in that moment the town understood what they had done. They had tried to bind one girl, and in doing so, they had unleashed 200 warriors who would never forgive. The revolt began not with gunfire, but with the shattering of certainty, with the realization that the town's walls, their rifles, their pride, meant nothing against the storm that now surrounded them. And as the warriors advanced, the settlers could do nothing but tremble, their jeers of yesterday dying on their lips, replaced by the silence of fear. And above it all, standing tall, was the girl who had been mocked, who had been forced, who had been silenced, now reborn as the voice of her people, the dawn itself bending around her revenge not in tears or cries, but in the unstoppable. march of warriors who had risen because of her, and the town knew this dawn would mark the end of their laughter, the end of their arrogance, and the beginning of a story whispered for generations. That they had mocked an Apache virgin, and, by dawn, she had returned with an army at her side.